Welcome to this presentation called Doing the Math. The subtitle, How Important It Is to Count the Cost, and how math was created so that we can. Presentation outline will actually start with math. What is it? Why is it important? And then we'll talk about how Jesus applied it and why he did. Some people will intuitively understand math, but the ones who don't might intuitively understand art. What is art? Art, like this photo that provides the background, it captures a moment, but it captures more than a moment. It captures the meaning of something, a feeling. It captures emotion. It captures connection. It allows for something of history or something of eternal value, something of love or of hate or anger or human condition. It captures that meaning. And it captures that meaning not just in some factual sense, but there's this sense in which it captures context. The water that's splashing up here is splashing up in a context of a sun down or a morning. I think it's a sundown. But the beauty of it cannot be communicated just with words. There's something more that is required to capture all that is in this moment of the sundown. And it's, again, not just an individual meaning of one thing, like a water droplet, but it is the meaning of those of things in context, in relationship. And so math does the same thing as art, and yet not, because it's not so much about emotion as it is about facts that are laws and things that connect. Math can communicate so much, but it has to capture it first. And that's really what happens with math with numbers. When we want to communicate so many different things, magnitude of something, connection of parts to each other, movement, change. Math gives us the tools, the means by which to capture that. And again, it not only will capture it, but it allows us to communicate it. It's so basic to our lives. Think of a day that would go by that you don't in some way use math. Perhaps you think, well, I'll never use calculus. You use calculus, or you take advantage of calculus every time you drive across a bridge. Every time, most likely, that you use your phone or your computer, because there is calculus embedded in many computer programs. If you enjoy this picture that's shown on the screen, that picture almost entirely is there because of math. Somebody figured out the math of how to express it. If you watch movies by Pixar, there's incredible amounts of math in that. A recent movie came out that had a lot of, there was an animated movie that had a lot of water. Some of the most famous are Finding Nemo and Finding Dory. Those movies have movement of water. In order to get that movement of water, they had to figure out the math of the movement of water and the relationship of water molecules to one another. So math is extremely important and basic to our lives, especially in the era in which we live. We don't realize it most of the time. But even in ancient times, when they appreciated the planets moving about each other, how do they do that? How do they consistently move about? It's all governed by math. And there have been certain types of math, certain formulas that have come to our understanding in recent years, and yet those laws or mathematical rules have been governing the universe and the movements of the universe since its beginning. So it allows us to communicate meaning and relationship in a different way than art, and yet in some very important ways. And beyond being able to capture and communicate meaning and relationship of what is, it allows us to imagine what could be, to envision and to plan the future, once we understand how things work and have worked in the past. It allows us to predict them in the future. That's what weather forecasting is. It's math. It's somebody who has studied, well, not one person. It is this whole body of knowledge that they have developed an understanding of the math of weather. And by understanding the math of weather and by seeing what the current conditions are at a given time or around the globe, they are able to imagine and envision what the weather will be. Now, they're not always right because there are always new factors, but they're getting better and better at being able to predict things with amazing precision, to the point of how warm it will be at 3 o'clock this afternoon. So how did Jesus apply math? Well, let's take a look at this passage in Luke chapter 14 and read verses 28 through 32. He says, "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace." So what are these two situations that Jesus is talking about? Well, they're solved with math. They are, in both cases, something where the situation is quantifiable. In the case of the tower, you know how tall the tower has to be and how wide it has to be, and therefore you can figure out how many materials it will take, and you can get a pretty good idea of the labor cost from previous projects. So doesn't it make sense that you would sit down and see whether you can complete it or not? In fact, have any of you ever seen somebody with a half-finished house, perhaps along the highway? You've seen a house that was started, but then all of a sudden they weren't able to finish. Occasionally there are people who don't do the math, or at least don't do it well. And as a result, they end up embarrassed because they could have known ahead of time, if they had done the math, that they didn't have what it took to finish. And then, of course, there's the case of the king. He's got 10,000 men. How well trained are they? How skilled are they? How many can they take on each? Because he knows somebody's coming with 20,000 against him. They count the people, and they know ahead of time, based on the math, whether they have a chance. And if not, why go into it? Why step into a situation that you can't handle, that you're not willing to really handle? So Jesus is telling them, use the math, figure it out. But why? Why did Jesus refer to this? It wasn't just to get people thinking about the value of math. So what was it? Well, if you look at the verses before the parable and then the verses afterwards, so in the middle you'll see in a set of a yellow gold color I have the count cost parable, which is what was given on the last slide. And here we have the verses before the parable and the verses right after the parable. So let's read those. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them he said, If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. And then right after the parable, he says, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. And then he ends with, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. These are pretty serious words that Jesus is sharing here. So what is he trying to say? Well, notice that it starts with large crowds were traveling with Jesus. That's because he did miracles. He healed people. He took care of people. He taught them, gave them wisdom, and eventually he gave them food. And so I think amongst these people were a lot of people who were, well, they had this picture of Jesus that he was there to give them everything they wanted. And they were in it for what they could get. And so he says these radical words, not to tell us to be hateful, but to really say, you know what? You've got to die to this life. It's not about this life. It's not about bread. It's not about a healthy body. It's not about healthy relationships even, although those are good. Other verses tell us, of course, that Jesus teaches us to love more important than anything else. So the word hate here is not anger or violence towards people. What he's really talking about is what I've underlined, and that is the being willing to carry our cross and follow him, to be willing to give up anything and everything, even our own lives. That there's nothing we can be selfish about. There's nothing that we can make more important than what he calls us to do. And that's really what it's saying. Jesus is saying, unless you are really going to follow me, don't follow me. Don't don't even start if you're not willing to really let everything else go for the sake of following me. And then that's what he says afterwards. So let's look at those words. He said, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything cannot be disciples. And this reference to salt that comes is referring to people who claim to be followers of Jesus, claim to follow his teaching, his life, everything else, but are fake. That's like salt, that the actual salt essence of it is gone from it. And people who say that they follow Christ, that really won't die to themselves, won't give up everything else, really don't have substance. They don't have the reality of what Jesus Christ brings to life. And unfortunately, they're a very poor example to other people of what Jesus means when he says he can change our lives. So in essence, he's saying, we are not his disciples unless he is our Lord and God. And that there is no other Lord or God. And we need to count the cost. We need to understand the cost. We need to realize that he is not calling us to use him as a Sunday special or to use Christianity as a supplement to give us a richer life. We need to do the math. But when we do the math and we do decide to give up everything for him, of course, being God, we get all the more back. Do the math. Count the cost.